Coming up on this edition of The Climate Show, Gareth is back from the Climate Futures Conference where he's had a pretty good time there, and he's spoken to a whole bunch of guests, and in fact we've got some of those interviews on the show. Also, Gareth, we've got John Cook back.
Yes, we've got John back. He's going to be talking to us about scientific consensus and how one really exists.
And also the solutions as well. It's a special batteries edition of Solutions.
It's a batteries edition, yes, very important. Plus, and I don't want to depress everybody too quickly, but we'll be talking about the trillion tonnes that probably isn't a trillion.
That's all coming up on this edition of The Climate Show. This episode of The Climate Show is brought to you by Celsius.co.nz, HotTopic.co.nz, SkepticalScience.com, Scoop.co.nz, and Kiwi FM.
Drop in the ocean. What good is a drop in the ocean?
It's time for The Climate Show, episode number 11, recording April 13th, 2011. A show all about climate science, news, policy, politics, and the solutions as well. My name's Glenn Williams. I'm here in the Kiwi FM studio, recording in Ponsonby, Auckland City, New Zealand. And my co-host, Gareth Ronalden from hot-topic.co.nz in North Canterbury, Waipara there. G'day, Gareth.
Hi, Glenn. How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. I'm feeling a little bit meek about what happened last time on the show. The show recording and everything went fine, but I tried a little bit too hard in the video side of things, recording in 720p. The computer I was using wasn't able to cope with that. So long story short, we could only put out the audio last time, but we did have the David Suzuki interview. So apologies for those people who were looking forward to the full-length video. But it's technical issues all around at the moment, Gareth.
Oh, tell me about it. Yes, I got back into the office about an hour ago, and discovered that there was a problem at Hot Topic. I've traced it back to a database issue. That means I'm going to have to go and restore the database from a backup. Fortunately, having been hacked before, and I don't think actually this was a hack. I think this is just a glitch or a gremlin or a bug or something. Yeah. But anyway, having done it before, I do know what I am supposed to be doing, and we do take regular backups. Yeah. So we have backups every 12 hours, so we might only lose a couple of comments. We won't lose anything substantial. As
we were recording right now, Hot Topic, the site is up, but there's no posts. It was like there was never any information there. It was like history's been erased completely.
Yeah,
it never
absolutely,
happened.
Yeah, it's a tabula rasa. It's a blank sheet. Yes.
Yeah, indeed. We're looking forward to a great show this time around. Now, we don't have a special guest as such, but we do have a lot of news to get through, and we do have a whole bunch of short-form interviews that you actually did at the Climate Futures Forum. You've had a busy couple of weeks.
Yeah, actually, it's I was up in Wellington for that for 2 days, 3 nights, whatever that means. Yes, so that was a busy time. I was able to use my aging iPhone with a special little app and record some interviews. That was good because it was a proof of concept. It works. And then so that I was able to get some of the key presenters, some of the stuff that really interested me. David Karoly, Professor David Karoly from Australia, talking about carbon budgets, and Dr. David Frame from Oxford University, who's actually going to be the next head of the Climate Change Research Institute at VUW. Professor Robert Gifford from the University of Victoria in British Columbia in Canada, with a really interesting talk he gave on how the psychology, how human psychology interacts with environmental issues, and the sorts of things, he calls them dragons, the sorts of things that stop us or make it harder for us to do the things we really need to do. And then, of course, Eric Conway, we interviewed his co-author, Naomi Oreskes, back in an earlier show about their book, Merchants of Doubt. And so I just had grabbed him for a couple of minutes before we went on stage. On the Friday night, we had to do a sort of all authors together. We had Fred Pearce, who's the author of any number of books on climate change, most recently The Climate Files, about the email theft from the University of East Anglia in Britain.
Yeah.
Fred Pearce, Eric Conway, and myself, with the redoubtable Sean Plunkett in the chair. And yeah, we had a bit of a natter for an hour or so. So yeah, all went well. I enjoyed myself. It was good fun.
Yeah.
It was a bit. I said in my post on Hot Topic, it was a bit like being back at university, having loads of really smart people telling you things. And no, I found it was very interesting.
And I managed to bump into Eric Conway because he was doing a wee bit of a tiki tour around New Zealand. He arrived in Auckland. It was last week now, and. It was him and a bunch of journalists, and it was basically talking about communicating climate science and some of the pitfalls with communicating it, and how to get around some of the skeptical arguments, or how to debunk some of the skeptical arguments as well. I just felt like getting up and sort of, I don't know, throttling a few journalists and saying, just don't even talk about it, or don't even talk, do the climate stuff, but don't have this continuous need for balance, which is something that we've talked about on the show before. But
it's very difficult as a journalist. Well, I mean, you and I are both journalists in our way, and conflict is always a good story. And so all the skeptics have to do is bounce up and down and pretend that there's a debate or a conflict or controversy around the subject.
Yeah,
and it's really difficult to resist. I mean, in a way, when I go and try to debunk skeptic articles or skeptic talking points, I'm helping to generate the conflict. And yes, it would be much easier if we could just ignore them and they might fade away. But as the Rolling Stones said, I don't think they're going to fade away.
Indeed.
Actually, it was the Who. It was the Who. Sorry.
Oh, was it? Just a few housekeeping issues. Don't forget to subscribe to the show. The audio version up there on iTunes, and of course, there's the YouTube version as well, and also take a look at our Facebook site, facebook.com/The Climate Show, and stay in touch with when the new episodes come out on twitter.com/The Climate Show as well, and of course theclimateshow.com and hot-topic.co.nz. Plenty of ways to interact and get involved with the show. In fact, we'll try and talk about some of the feedback a little bit later on the show. But just getting back to the Climate Futures Forum, was it worthwhile? Was it an engaging kind of atmosphere where there are quite a few people attending and learning about stuff?
I think there were something like 180 people registered for the 2 days. So I thought that was a particularly good turnout. What was impressive was just the sheer range of people from all over the world. Obviously, the invited speakers had been flown in from around the world. But there was a very wide spectrum of people from New Zealand, from all levels of government, local government, politicians, activists, people working for environmental NGOs. It was absolutely fascinating, partly to meet these people. And I have to tell you too, sobering moments, because I realized that most of these people are actually reading what I write. And that's, it's very, very nice to know that there are smart people reading the blog. It's a little bit more worrying when you realize that, you've just been extremely rude about a government minister.
Yeah.
And it might be in his briefing documents in the morning. So I'll have to remember not to blog after 3 glasses of red wine anymore.
Wasn't there some rule about that? Isn't there some rule? There should be some process you go through, having had a drink, and before you actually tweet something or text something. I think Google, Gmail have a great thing in their email. I think you have to answer some very simple mathematical questions before you send the email.
I'd probably fail. No, back to the show though. The forum I thought was fantastic because it provided some interesting new perspectives on the way that we should look at climate change and taking action on climate change, and it put it before a very broad range of people. And the forum itself was organized in such a way that there was an awful lot of discussion and debate about the individual talks after they were given. And they had rapporteurs who would listen to the discussions and then report them back to the whole conference. So there was a lot of toing and froing and whizzing around, but you got the opportunity to directly talk to the speakers, ask them the questions that you thought were important, and have that then reflected back in the sort of general for the general audience. So I thought it was very well organized, and I found it very, very stimulating. A little later in the show, we're going to talk about one aspect, the idea of looking at carbon in the atmosphere as a stock problem rather than a flow problem. So instead of thinking about the rates of emissions, we should think about the absolute amount of carbon in the atmosphere, having a carbon budget, which is an interesting and somewhat sobering way to look at the problem that we confront, particularly in the light of a new paper that was being recently published. So we're going to come back to talk about that a little later in the show, and we'll listen to David Karoly talking about that. But time perhaps to move on with the rest of the news, Glenn.
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, that's right. We're not short of experts visiting New Zealand at the moment, and we're looking forward to Mr. Jim Hansen coming to New Zealand soon.
Yes, that's Dr. James to you.
Oh, okay. So, it's good, sir. Yes.
Yes. Jim Hansen is possibly the world's best-known climate scientist. A very interesting guy. One of the most outspoken of the climate scientists in the world. He basically came up with the number 350 parts per million, which was adopted by Bill McKibben for the 350.org effort. Basically, he believes that we are already well above the acceptable level of carbon in the atmosphere, and that we need to institute urgent cuts and then go beyond that and remove carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah.
His most recent sort of efforts have been directed at persuading companies in the US and governments in the US and also in the UK to leave coal in the ground. He has sort of done calculations that suggest, and I hope I'm not paraphrasing him unfairly here, that in fact oil doesn't really matter. We can burn all the oil if we want to, but if we burn all the coal, or we get a long way into burning the coal, we will put ourselves into a situation where the climate will be radically changed. And his last book was called Storms of My Grandchildren, and it's a very interesting read. I recommend it highly.
So is it a case of one or the other and not both, or we cannot dig the coal, but we can burn all the oil, or can we dig up the coal and not have the oil?
Hansen's position is that there isn't enough oil to cause a problem. We need the liquid fuels, but if we start turning coal into liquid fuels, basically there's so much coal around that we'll end up burning and putting so much carbon into the atmosphere that we'll end up with big problems.
Right.
So his position, he has two sort of key positions. The first is that we should not be mining coal. We should be cutting out coal as soon as possible. And the other is that he doesn't like cap and trade or emissions trading. He prefers what he calls a sort of tax and dividend approach, so that you would have a carbon charge that everybody would pay, but you would get it rebated to you. So you would end up with individuals having an incentive to cut their own emissions and would get a check at the end of the year for so doing.
Yeah.
So whilst there would be a charge put into the economy, instead of it going straight into government coffers, it would come back to the individuals. So that's probably unlikely to happen just because the world is so far down a line with emissions trading. But it's not impossible. So Jim's coming over in May. His first meeting is on the 12th of May in Auckland, and the talk he's going to be giving is titled Climate Change, a Scientific, Moral and Legal Issue. Now, a moral and legal issue because he has He's been arrested on demonstrations against coal mining in the US. He's testified in court in the UK on behalf of campaigners who are trying to close down coal power stations. So he's going to give us presumably an overview of what he's been up to. So that starts on the 12th of May in Auckland. That's in the University of Auckland Business School. You can get the full tour details at Hot Topic when it's working again. Then he goes to Palmerston North on the 13th, Wellington on the 16th, Wellington again on the 17th, and this is fascinating. He's taking part in a day-long symposium on the future of coal. And that's been put together by the Institute of Policy Studies at VUW. And also appearing at that symposium will be Don Elder, who's the CEO of Solid Energy.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah. Is it sponsored by Solid Energy?
No, I don't know. It's been put together by the Institute of Policy Studies, who are kind of resolutely non-partisan. So they're just sort of putting the two men in a room, and I expect sparks will fly. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see how Solid Energy respond to the moral, the scientific, moral and legal case for leaving coal in the ground, particularly in light of their lignite plans in Southland, plans to mine lignite and turn it into liquid fuels and so on.
Right.
So following that day in Wellington, he's actually going down to Dunedin, and then on the Thursday, the 19th of May, he's going to be in Gore, and he's actually going to go and look at the site of the proposed Solid Energy lignite stuff. So I think we can look forward to a reasonable amount of press coverage for Jim's activities while he's here.
Will we find him chained to a tractor or something?
I don't think so. He's going around with Jeanette Fitzsimons. She's his minder.
Okay.
And Jeanette is a soul of discretion, so I imagine he'll be quite safe. And then on the Friday the 20th of May, he's going to be in Christchurch. He's going to give a talk at the university and also then a public talk at 5:30. And I'm very much hoping that Hot Topic and the Climate Show can get hold of Dr. Hansen on that day and record some sort of interview with him.
Yeah.
We're trying to work it all out with the organisers at the moment, but fingers crossed.
Okay.
I really want to talk. I want to talk to him about, well, apart from all the coal stuff, I'd quite like to talk to him about the Eemian, which is the last interglacial, which has played an important part, or what happened in the Eemian has played quite an important part in deciding Hansen's position on where we are and where we need to be and so on. So anyway, looking forward to that. It should be a very interesting couple of weeks while he's here.
All right, well, moving along, new news out about the Arctic sea ice melt, and there's a new warning. Scientists who predicted a few years ago that Arctic summers could be ice-free by 2013 now say summer sea ice probably will be gone in this decade.
Yes, it's a slight update to a projection that was made by a US Navy scientist called Wisław Maslowski. He works at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey in California. And he has built a very kind of detailed model of the Arctic, a climate model of the Arctic. And now his refined model and his latest projections suggest that we could have an Arctic that was ice-free in summer, so at the minimum, which is usually in September, by 2016, plus or minus 3 years. So between 2013 and 2019, you could end up with a seasonally ice-free Arctic Ocean. Now that is by some way, and Maslowski is not really changing his position here. He's always been the most aggressive of the scientists working in the field in terms of projecting an early loss of sea ice. Most of the more mainstream positions would be in the 2020s or 2030s. The last IPCC report, the fourth report, suggested it could be the sort of second half of this century. But this is something I've written about quite a few times on Hot Topic, and what Maslowski is doing, and it's an argument which I haven't seen particularly strongly refuted, although there is at least one blogger working on that at the moment. And it comes down to this question of ice volume. we've been losing a large volume of sea ice. It's like there's the volume of ice up there that survives all year round acts like a kind of buffer. So we get a warm year, some of it melts. To get a cold year, some of it regrows. If you project that forward, which is effectively what Maslowski's doing, although he's relying on a very sophisticated model to produce his numbers, when you project that loss of ice forward, eventually you end up with a situation where a warm year will finally mean that at the absolute minimum, there isn't much ice around at all.
Yeah.
So we're probably not talking about an Arctic that's completely ice-free in September. We're probably talking about the ocean being open, and there might be a few 100,000, maybe 500,000 or more square kilometers of ice clinging on to the islands to the north of Canada. But effectively, the rest of the ocean would be open for at least a brief period.
And so, as I understand it, the implications for that are that without the ice, or when the ice is there, a lot of the sun's heat and rays are reflected back off into space. But when it's not there, the ocean is absorbing the heat. Is that right?
Yeah. What seems to have been happening so far is that because most of the heat that arrives at the Earth is absorbed by the planet at the equator, and it's moved around by oceans and atmosphere. Now, some of that heat's been finding its way up to the Arctic and has been reducing the amount of ice. Now, what happens when the ice goes, as you say, you get these dark oceans open, and they can hit the sunlight hitting them warms them up much more efficiently than it does bouncing off nice shiny white ice. So you get what's called the albedo flip. So the albedo is the shiny reflection of the planet, the reflectance of the planet. And so the rays bounce out. Dark oceans have a lower albedo, so they absorb more heat. And you end up with warmer oceans, more heat accumulating in the system, takes longer for the ice to refreeze in autumn. So that effect will come into play over larger and larger parts of the Arctic Ocean as this decade goes on, if Maslowski's right. But you then also get a knock-on effect, and we've talked about this on the show a couple of times at least, and that is that as the ice refreezes in autumn, which is going to do for many decades into the future, even if warming continues, you're always going to end up with a frozen ocean, at least for, as I say, for many decades in the future. As that ice reforms, it gives heat up to the atmosphere, and that has the effect. And we think we can see this, or I think we can see this emerging in Northern Hemisphere early winter weather patterns. The heat comes up, changes the flow of the atmosphere around the Northern Hemisphere, and has the potential at least to create cold weather, as the sort of cold weather that we saw in the eastern US and Britain and Western Europe before Christmas last year. So it's fairly major. It's one of the areas where climate change is happening. It's happening fast, and where we can begin to see pretty clear signs that it's having impacts.
Okay, moving along. The Bangkok climate talks have been on, and the deep divisions apparently in last December's climate deal in Cancun were reopened at these climate talks, UN talks they are, undermining the chance of any agreement on the shape of a broader pact by the end of this year. Yet again, the politicians don't seem to be able to get it together, Gareth.
Yes, it's thoroughly depressing, and it comes back to this thing that the developing countries want to stick to the Kyoto Protocol and have a follow-up to Kyoto, which allows, which means that the developed countries accept that they have to cut emissions and do so perhaps rather more steeply than the developing world. However, the holdouts, which is kind of US and Australia and so on, say, well, we don't want to do this unless India and China also take on board some sorts of commitments, and they would prefer not a follow-up to Kyoto, but something based on the Copenhagen Accord. So basically, tear up Kyoto and start all over again with something different. So there is a big divide on the future of Kyoto and any successor follow-up treaty. So it's it's depressing. But Cancun, there was some progress, but not on that major issue at Cancun. And so this Bangkok meeting was supposed to try and clear the way for a solution to be for the Durban conference at the end of the year.
Yes, and
doesn't look like it's going to happen.
No, and while these talks carry on, of course, greenhouse gases still keep on getting emitted and into the atmosphere. And now there's this is a great new website called trillionthton.org that is counting up and up and up and up. And I don't even know what number is it. That's 546 million tons of carbon. Am I right to say that's 546 million?
Yeah, that's 546 billion tons of carbon.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Crikey.
So when that gets to a trillion, then we will certainly be over 2 degrees Celsius. So it's actually not a new site. It's been around for a while, but I wanted to talk about it because it's relevant to one of the presentations at the Climate Futures Forum and to a new paper that's come out in the last couple of weeks. So I think this is probably a good time to introduce Professor David Karoly and let him explain why we should think about the trillion tons of carbon and what that means for the way we think about limiting future emissions.
What I wanted to pick up with you, David, was the things that you said to us about a carbon budget, the trillion tons that we've got, and the implications of that for the way that we look at the carbon targets, the emissions targets.
Sure, and so what I was talking about is an approach that is being used to think about the impacts of increasing greenhouse gas, and particularly increasing carbon dioxide concentrations on the climate system.
Yep.
And the reframing, or it's the thinking about this, is that the very long lifetime for the removal of additional carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere by natural processes means that we can think of that carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels as building up, accumulating, and the typical lifetime for complete removal by natural processes is more than 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So if we look at just the next 50 years, it's the accumulated emissions that stay in the atmosphere that are causing the warming of the global climate.
So what's the significance of the trillion tons?
Okay, so you can then look at, if you like, the change in concentration is just the sum,
Yep.
the total amount of emissions over a period. And then the temperature change is then dependent upon the changing concentrations, which is dependent upon the sum of the emissions.
Yep.
So in Copenhagen in 2009, the governments of the world agreed to limit greenhouse gas emissions at a level that would try to limit temperature change to only 2 degrees above pre-industrial.
Yep.
So that analysis has then been used to think about, well, how much greenhouse gas emissions, in particular, how much carbon dioxide emissions, because carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas with a long lifetime, what carbon dioxide emissions would that mean, for instance, over the 50-year period from 2000 to 2050?
Yep.
And the round number, and unfortunately it's a very big round number with lots and lots of zeros, is 1,000 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuel burning.
Yep.
As a reasonable estimate gives you 75% chance of staying below 2 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels. So about 1 and a bit degrees warmer than now.
Yeah.
So that's 1,000 billion tonnes. That's a big, big number.
But it gets a lot smaller when you divide it up amongst countries.
Exactly. So there are lots and lots of different ways to think about how you might divide that 1,000 billion tonnes up. But one way to think about, if you like, equity, fair distribution, would be to think about this in terms of a sum of money.
Yep.
Should everyone get the same sum of money?
Yep.
Well, okay, that's a reasonable and fair approach. So let's think about dividing this carbon budget equally amongst the 6.7 or nearly 7 billion people in the world.
Yep.
And it's easier to divide by 7 than it is by 6.7. So 7 into into a 1,000 is about 140 tonnes per person. It's actually 145 closer, but let's think of 140.
Yep.
That's the budget for each person to emit in terms of tons of carbon dioxide from, it was actually 2000, but let's think of 2010 to 2050. Because if you think about 2000, and we'll talk about this in a minute, that budget might have already been used up. But let's think about it now from 2010 to 2050, 140 tons per person. Well, in developing countries where the emissions per person are in fact quite small, in India, for instance, 2 to 3 tons per person, they've actually got a lot more than 50 years at their current rate. They can actually develop and use more emissions. However, Australia is either the highest or one of the highest emission countries per capita in the world at roughly 20 to 25 tonnes of emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning. It's actually closer to 20 tonnes from fossil fuel burning. That implies 7 years at current emission rates before Australia uses up its allocation. So that would mean you either have 7 years at the current rate and then 0 for the remaining 33 years, or Australia has to actively engage in international carbon trading to try to get some allowance, or in fact purchase emissions trading benefits from other countries around the world, and either buy from India or buy from China or buy from African countries in return for large financial payments, a right to emit more than its fair share into the atmosphere of carbon dioxide.
Yeah. Now, I find that kind of budget idea a very powerful idea. I've got 140 tonnes left.
Yeah,
that's quite good. Now, when I go to Europe later this year, I'm going to use up a big chunk.
Exactly,
of that.
And I used up a large chunk travelling to New Zealand for this conference.
Yeah.
In some sense, I should have done it by teleconference, but then I wouldn't have been able to come and talk on this Hot Topics blog. Well, I would, but...
Well, absolutely, but we'll do it by Skype next time. And
exactly.
I promise we'll have an extended interview. David Corelli, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Cheers.
Okay, so if you follow what David was saying, and then look again at that trillionthtonne.org website, you'll see that what they're doing there is that they've said we've got this trillion tons to play with. If we want to have a 50-50 chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to keep total emissions. Doesn't matter when they're put out, because carbon dioxide hangs around for a long time. We have to keep total emissions below 1,000 billion, i.e. a trillion tons of carbon. If we want to have a 75% chance of remaining below 2 degrees Celsius, we need to keep the total carbon to 750 billion tons of carbon. So, in other words, the lesser the amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere, the better our chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the bad news, and this is a paper that came out in GRL this month, I think, if I'm right. It's by Aurora et al. And the Canadian climate model is working with the latest version of their climate model, running it with emissions pathways that are being used for the IPCC's 5th report. So this is, really current stuff. It's going to be fed into the AR5, as it's probably going to be called. And their paper's called Carbon Emission Limits Required to Satisfy Future Representative Concentration Pathways of Greenhouse Gases. It's in GRL, and I'll put the links and so on in the show notes. But I've also blogged about it in a post called A Ton Too Far, which nobody can read at the moment because of my database problem.
Yeah.
But what this paper basically does is finds that we have already surpassed the cumulative emission limit, and emissions must ramp down to 0 immediately if we're to have a reasonable chance of staying under the 2 degrees Celsius target.
And so immediately isn't next week, it's not next year or in the next decade. It means right now, it's right this minute, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It means that if you look at that trillionthtonne.org site and you look at those numbers whizzing past you on the screen, it means that basically those numbers have got to stop now. Now this is, not trivial. There is no way that the world can wean itself off carbon overnight. It's going to take decades to get ourselves down to zero emissions. Even if we have a huge wartime type effort, if all the governments of the world suddenly agreed tomorrow that this was a really huge problem that they ought to take as seriously as an invasion from the neighboring country, or a global financial meltdown, then it would still take decades to stop. So this Canadian paper is suggesting that we have a really, really big problem, and that the world, and that it's not unique to this paper, other papers have suggested it, that the emissions pathway we're on has us more likely heading for 3 or 4 degrees Celsius than it does heading for under 2. Other papers have suggested that the commitments made in Copenhagen simply fail to give us any chance of hitting 2 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about the treating carbon, this carbon budget, there's 2 interesting aspects to it. First is what the size of the overall budget is. Now, Aurora et al. Are suggesting that we actually don't have much of a budget at all if we want to restrict warming to something survivable. And then how do you divide it up? So, I mean, that David Karoly talks about taking an equity approach and just saying that everybody on the planet has the right to emit the same amount of carbon. So you divide it up that way, and you find that countries like Australia and the US and New Zealand run out of our budget really, really quickly, whereas countries like India and China and Brazil and so on, Indonesia, have a lot longer to go before they use up their chunk of the budget. It's very similar to an approach that was called Cap and Converge, which was to try to get everybody down to emitting the same amount of carbon by, say, 2050. But really, what struck me most, and I go back to the Climate Futures Forum here, and a note I put in my report, was that Nick Smith, who's the New Zealand climate change minister, very proudly opened the conference by announcing that the government was finally committing to a target of cutting New Zealand's carbon emissions by 50% in 2050. So, yep, that very good. Thank you very much. That's been National Party policy for 4 years, and you're finally making it official. But then he buggered off, and he didn't stay to listen to David Karoly talking about the budget.
About why that is unrealistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, updated with this Canadian research, and probably with more research to come, suggesting that the budget is even smaller than 1 trillion tonnes if you want a sensible thing. Suddenly, New Zealand's government policy, and in fact government policies all around the world, start to look ridiculously out of line with what the evidence is suggesting we really need to be thinking about doing. So Bangkok, bad news. Can they sort it out in Durban? Will there be some sort of cobbled together deal? Well, yeah, there might be. But will it be any sort of deal that addresses the problem at the kind of scale that it really needs to be? And that's what makes me depressed, because I don't think there's any political will anywhere in the world, even in the countries that are doing something about this seriously, to actually address the problem that the scale and sheer scale and horrendousness of the problem that's confronting us. Yeah. So sorry about raining on everybody's parade, but this is I urge people to go and look at the trillionthtonne.org site. It's a sobering site.
Well, and also sobering, I'm only a quarter of the way through, but Clive Hamilton's book called Requiem for a Species. If you want to feel positive about where we're headed, do not read that book, because you won't find anything positive, because we're doomed. It makes you wonder what's the point in doing this show?
Well, I know. Look, the thing is, Glenn, that it just underlines how important it is to get this message out. We need somehow to give our politicians the ammunition they need, the support they need to do the things that are required. And no politician is going to act unless there's a constituency, a large constituency out there demanding this sort of action.
Well, maybe we could dig into this another time, because this may be opening another can of worms. But something I've just read in Clive Hamilton's book, he says that we can meet these targets if all developed countries put off doubling their GDP or doubling their household income by 1 year.
Yes, that's a pretty common view amongst people who've looked at the costs of addressing climate change. It's basically what the Stern report said 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And it's probably right, but I accept that it's predicated on us still emitting carbon at some point in the future. And what this latest research is beginning to show is that we really don't have the time to do it. If we allow ourselves 40 years to eliminate carbon from eliminate carbon emissions, then we are going to end up with a great deal more than 1 trillion tons, or whatever the allowable limit actually turns out to be.
Because it's the accumulation, right?
It's the accumulation, yeah. The CO2, unless we actively remove CO2 by planting vast amounts of forest, which is probably a good thing to do, and I would support, or by using carbon capture and storage, artificial trees, so on, using biomass to basically bury carbon. Unless those things start to happen, then the world is looking at not a mere 2 degrees, which in itself is likely to be difficult for many parts of the world, but double that maybe. So it's tough.
Yeah, it is tough. So before we move on, it might be worth mentioning this new research that suggests Scotland could halve their carbon emissions in 2 decades, according to a new study.
Yeah, well, actually, they say they can cut their emissions by 50% by 2020, and within 20 years. Sorry, not 2020. Yeah. Silly me. They looked at, this is people from the University of Edinburgh School of Geosciences and Business School, actually looked at US figures and worked out how various low carbon strategies could work, and then applied this idea to Scotland's economy. And they felt basically that it was halving emissions within 20 years was achievable at an acceptable economic cost. So, there is evidence out there that it could be done.
Well, what's acceptable to one person is not acceptable to another, or what is acceptable to one political party is not acceptable to another.
Yeah, and let's not forget, as we'll hear later on from Eric Conway, there's actually been a concerted campaign to prevent action on climate change, funded by fossil fuel interests and by ideologues who think that taking action on climate is tantamount to introducing socialism to the world. So we've got a really difficult problem, a hugely difficult problem. That everything that it's possible we could solve this problem if we take it really, really seriously and act really, really quickly, but the odds are stacked against it.
Okay, well, before we move on to the feature interviews from the Climate Futures Forum that Gareth did, I'd like to thank our media partners at scoop.co.nz for featuring the show quite prominently, and thank you very much to those guys over there, particularly Selwyn Manning, for getting the show up there on the front page and featuring for a while, and also over at celsius.co.nz as well, CELSIAS. Who's the first interview? Who's the first chat?
Okay, the first chat is with Dr. David Frame, who is currently at the University of Oxford. He's a physicist. He was actually, he trained at the Treasury, New Zealand Treasury. So he's that very rare beast, a sort of a physicist with economics training. And he presented a very interesting talk about what he called a Mexican standoff or a low carbon race. And basically with an economist colleague, they tried to reframe the way that people talk about the taking climate action in international negotiations. So anyway, here's David to explain what he was talking about.
And David's just given us a wonderful presentation about a Mexican standoff or a low-carbon race. David, just give us an idea of the presentation.
Well, it's kind of just a perturbation, really, to a fairly long-standing framing of the problem. So people often describe climate as an issue with two agents, with a rich world and a poor world, or a north and a south, or in the really technical jargon, Annex 1 and non-Annex countries. And what Cameron Hepburn and I have been exploring is how going to a three-agent model, which picks out the people who've been doing very well in the last 20 or 30 years, enriches the picture a little bit. So we're considering, and we look at two sorts of models, two sorts of three-agent models, which are related but not identical. And they're basically, you're looking at the OECD, the traditional developed countries, and then the emerging markets, the powerful emerging markets from the G20, and then the rest of the world.
So you're talking India, Brazil, China,
Turkey, those guys, And what we try and do is consider three scenarios: one in which there is no deal, which is an unfortunate scenario down the track, and one in which the North leads and they undertake 80% cuts in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and the third in which the North leads, they are joined in this by those countries in the G20, the emerging markets, who just simply stabilise their emissions at 2005 levels. And basically what we show is that is just how powerful a lever those emerging markets are, given their demographic mass, they're very large countries, and also their increasing economic clout. And that economic clout is a terrific thing, it's very good. But with it, unfortunately, comes a six-fold emission or thereabouts in greenhouse gas emissions between about now and about the end of the century. So essentially, avoiding most of that does a lot of work, and it does about twice as much work as the reduction in the rich world, which is this 80% reduction by 2050.
So what I was thinking about as you were talking through that in the presentation was, how does that fit in with the sort of 1,000 gigaton carbon budget that David Karoly was talking about?
Well, I'm not directly. I very much prefer the budgetary approach, but I mean, this was an illustrative picture just simply to show how where the real levers of the emissions, the future emissions are, and that future emissions will look very different from past emissions. I disagree with David about the allocation of that budget. I don't think you should prior allocate these things. There's no precedent for that. We don't give people a per capita allowance of aluminium or diamonds or gold or oil. So why do it in this case? It's a popular option among many, but it lacks precedent, and it's quite politically, would set a very strong political precedent towards the socialisation of resources. That was his allocation method. As for the budgetary approach and auctioning that budget, I think that'd be a great idea.
Okay.
But I'd reserve some at the bottom for the very poorest.
So how do we get these emerging nations, the Brazils and Chinas and so on, to play within that sort of framework?
Well, I think that was another part of the talk, really, that if we're unlucky, if we are unlucky, then we may end up just simply entrenching existing tensions and adding new ones to them and getting further lockdown. But at the same time, if there really are payoffs to innovation, and if the increase in global demand for energy really is a stimulus to investment in R&D, and I think that's absolutely crucial, then you could get a low carbon race, and that would be the happy ending, where we innovate our way out of a technological problem.
Now, one of the slides you didn't really have much time to expand on was China and the sheer amount of capital they're putting into renewables and carbon trading and so on.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, China's a fascinating place. They have, something like, I think it was in The Economist the other week, 800,000 millionaires and 400 million people on $2 a day or something like that. It's a vast country which is growing phenomenally fast, and as countries that grow fast always do, they have distributional issues. But one of the things they're doing is trying to get energy to people who haven't had it, and so they're just they're the greatest deployer of renewable energy on Earth. They're the greatest deployer of all energy on Earth at the moment. It's a priority.
I visited China a few years ago, and I was amazed that next door to the bike shop that you see in every Chinese town, there was a solar hot water shop selling rooftop solar. It was an amazing sight. David, many thanks for joining us on Hot Topic, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to have a longer conversation at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thanks.
So that was David Frame at the Climate Futures Forum. Who's up next, Gareth?
Okay, now we're going to go to Professor Robert Gifford he's an environmental psychologist, and his talk was absolutely fascinating. This is stuff I haven't looked at really seriously since I was a wee stripling university student back in the 1970s. And he's looking at the way in which our psychology predisposes us to act in particular ways or to not act in particular ways. And he's identified a number of characteristics that he calls the climate dragons, the dragons that prevent us acting on climate change. So here's Bob to explain what he was talking about.
Bob, could you perhaps give us a bit of a précis of who these dragons are?
Well, there's a lot of different dragons, but they fall into about 7 different categories. One is limited cognition. That is, we don't think as clearly or as rationally as we would like to or we would hope that we do. Second would be sunk costs, that we have investments not only financial but in terms of our habits and whatever, and these tend to slow us down from taking the kind of actions that we would probably like to take. Third, we have a whole category of risks. People are relatively risk averse, and almost any kind of change, not only in terms of climate action but in other domains of behavior. We also are wary of making changes, and there are 6 or 7 different kinds of risks. Then we have a problem with limited behavior. We sometimes do a little bit and then think we've done enough when really more is necessary. Or we overcompensate when rewarding ourselves when we did a little good thing, then we do some not so good things, and it ends up in the negative category. Another problem is other people. We're heavily influenced by what other people do, people that we admire. We don't like to think we're conformists, but we are quite, in many ways, influenced by other people like ourselves or people that we admire. And if those people are not doing the right thing, there's a lot of pressure on us also perhaps not to do the right thing. So those are some of the dragons. There's a whole list of about 29 or 30 of them, but these are some of the most important ones.
Okay, and you also talked about mules and honeybees. And you gave us a wonderful equation that climate action meant mules plus honeybees minus dragons. And the mules are the hard workers. Explain the honeybees to me again.
Well, the mules are the people who are committed already. They have the right values, the right attitudes. They're out there doing their bit, whether they're activists in the community or activists just at home. But the honeybees are people who are, it's a kind of animal in this domain that I recently discovered, but they've always existed, and that is people who are totally self-interested but are actually helping the environment, even though they may not be in favor of the environment. The simple example would be somebody who insulates his home to save money, but not really for the environment, or the person who chooses not to have a child, or the person who cycles or cycles to work and is thinking of health, but doesn't really care about the environment. So a honeybee is somebody who's doing the right thing in terms of climate, but actually not for that reason.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic, Robert. Thanks very much. I've just heard the bell for the next session, so perhaps I ought to let you go and get on myself for the next section. So thank you very much for taking the time. Cheers.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Thanks.
So that was Professor Robert Gifford at the Climate Futures Forum talking to Gareth. And finally, Gareth, who else we got?
Right, we've got Naomi Oreskes' co-author, Eric Conway from NASA's JPL Labs, although he's keen to emphasize that he was traveling not representing NASA but on his own account. And I just asked Eric a quick question about the sort of viciousness of the campaign against climate scientists.
Eric, I wanted to ask you, through Merchants of Doubt, there's a clear pattern of really quite vicious attacks on climate scientists, vendettas almost against some of the top names in the field. Is that a clear pattern that you see emerging from the data?
Hi, yes. Well, first I have to say that I'm not here in my capacity as the NASA JPL historian, so Merchants of Doubt is all done in my own time and work. And yes, and I think that is a public relations tactic in a lot of ways, because once you've embedded in people's psyches a set of names, branding, if you will, you want to maintain that as long as you can. So you get these relentless attacks on a handful of people across a decade because you've already made those names familiar. Mm-hmm. And so you don't have to invest in making another set of names familiar. So there's no question in my mind that that's a deliberate tactic. It helps create the aura of doubt by fixing people on a very small subset of the evidence, too, of the scientific evidence. The attacks on Michael Mann's work in paleoclimate, for example, well, the guy's responsible for one graph out of literally hundreds in the IPCC studies, but you can impugn the whole massive 3,000 pages of the thing just by attacking that one guy in his graph.
Yeah. So do you think part of this is a desire to create talking points or sound bites for the sort of Tea Party Republicans who are now in government taking an active part in government in Washington?
Well, the Tea Party is just the latest manifestation of a long-standing movement within the GOP to reinforce a particular version of conservatism. Mm-hmm. But it actually they began forming that movement in the late 1960s. Yeah. The Tea Party is a 2008 phenomenon, but builds on the same basic idea. And sure, these attacks are aimed at cementing the idea of great conspiracy amongst climate scientists that's long-running and organized somehow by Democrats, the enemy. But it's not directly the Tea Party's fault because it's been going on since the 1980s, and they didn't exist that far back. Yeah.
Okay, Eric, that's fantastic. We're about to go on stage and talk to a man I must warn you is a bulldog. That's Sean Plunkett, who's famous in New Zealand radio. But thank you for finding the time, and welcome to Hot Topic. I hope it won't be the last time we speak.
Thank you.
As there was Eric Conway at the Climate Futures Forum there talking to Gareth about a couple of weeks ago now. Sounded like a great time there, Gareth.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I got to have a really good Chinese meal on the Friday night as well. So that with my son and daughter at the Yangtze restaurant in Wellington, which they do an excellent Peking duck.
Of course, hard to find any good restaurants open in Christchurch at the moment. Most of them are closed, from what I hear.
Yeah, most of my clients don't have restaurants anymore.
Yeah, it's a shame.
The people who buy truffles from me. Very, very sad.
All right, well, let's move on the show. Up next, Mr. John Cook, skepticalscience.com. We're debunking the skeptic. And John Cook's joining us now. Hello, John.
Hi, Glenn. How you going?
Very good, thanks.
How's life in sunny Australia?
Yeah, it's sunny.
Very good. So this week, we're going to be looking at the question of the scientific consensus and whether or not it exists.
Yeah, that's a topic that comes up quite a lot when people are talking about climate, and particularly for people who I guess haven't really dug deep into the science. Then what they tend to do is just look at, well, what are the experts saying, and that's how they get a read on where climate is at.
So is there climate consensus? I think that's the big question, really, isn't it?
Yeah, okay. Well, what I thought I would do is just to step back and give a broader picture first, just to give some context to the whole consensus question. Because I read a few years back, a paper that just looked at movements that deny a scientific consensus. And what they found was that every movement that denies a consensus, there's these particular characteristics that they all have in common. One, for example, is conspiracy theories. Because if almost all the scientists in the world are saying something you disagree with, it's almost inevitable that you have to conclude, well, they must all be conspiring to to deceive me or something like that.
Which is in fact the thought that underpins the whole ClimateGate thing, isn't it? Because ClimateGate was an explicit attempt to suggest that climate scientists were conspiring to misinform politicians in the world.
Well, that's why ClimateGate was so popular, because it fed that whole conspiracy theory idea. Yeah. So, and another characteristic that you see in all these denial movements is bringing up fake experts, and you see that in. I'll give a few examples. A funny example, which I found on the internet a little while ago, is a website called GalileoWasWrong.com. And what this website suggests is that back in the 1600s or whenever it was that we figured out that the Earth isn't the center of the universe, and we actually revolve around the sun. Well, this is a modern movement that says no, actually they had it right back in the 1600s, and everything does revolve around the Earth. and on this website, they have a list of all these people that subscribe to this view, and there's lots of PhDs and doctors and very qualified sounding names.
What are they doctors in?
I don't know if it says.
I don't think I'd want to go and have any of those doctors operate on me. Let's put it that way. Are you sure this isn't just a spoof?
Yeah.
That was my thought. I thought this has to be a hoax. But I mean, I have spoken to one person who has investigated it, and he verified that it was a genuine movement. So as far as I can tell, it is. But even okay. So let's hope that it is a spoof and it's a bit of a joke. But I do love the first topic there in the list of topics that they had at their conference, which was I can't quite read it. It said something like
geocentrism. Is that the one?
Yeah, read the rest of that line.
Geocentrism, they know it, but they're hiding it.
So again, you've got the fake experts and you've got the conspiracy theory. So that's quite funny. But a probably more serious, sinister example of fake experts is the tobacco industry. And they actually, back in the 70s, they had a strategy called Operation Whitecoat, where they would trot out these doctors or scientists who would tell us that smoking was fine and it wasn't bad for your health, and there was no evidence that smoking caused cancer, that kind of thing. So it's a common tactic when there's a scientific consensus which is based on a preponderance of evidence to bring up fake experts to try to cast doubt on the consensus.
But John, wasn't there 31,000 scientists who signed some kind of skeptic statement, some kind of petition?
Yeah, this is probably the most popular example of the fake expert idea amongst climate deniers. And in fact, on the weekend, I was talking to a small group, and they brought that up. They brought up the petition and saying, "Well, isn't there people with PhDs and scientists in this petition of 31,000 scientists?" And so, if you look at this petition that does have 31,000 names signed to it, and basically what the petition says is that there's no evidence that carbon dioxide will disrupt our climate. And in fact, they go on to say, well, carbon dioxide will actually have positive benefits for humanity. But if you look at all the names that are on the list, very few of them are actually climate scientists. I think the percentage is actually like 0.1% of them are actively publishing or climate scientists. And so what you have in there is mechanical engineers and medical doctors. Anyone who's got a PhD or even just a Bachelor of Science qualifies to get onto that list.
Well, how were they conned into signing? How did that happen?
Oh, I'm sure that the people who signed it would genuinely believe that that global warming won't. The evidence isn't. There's no evidence there, or whatever their skeptic viewpoint is. So
this was over 10 years ago too. So
okay.
It was a time when perhaps the science wasn't quite as crystal clear as it is already.
I think
be fair, John.
Well, yeah, I guess so. But I'm sure that there would still be a number of scientists who would even sign it today.
Yeah.
But the main point is that when you have a complicated topic, the person who is most qualified to talk about that is someone who's an expert in that field. So, for example, if you were getting heart surgery, you wouldn't get a mechanical engineer to operate on you.
Yeah.
And if you wanted someone to build a bridge, you wouldn't ask a medical doctor to design it and work out all the physics of the bridge.
It's the same situation with our old friend Monkton, isn't it? I mean, he's not a climate scientist. He may be an expert in some areas, but he's not. He's not all that about climate science.
Well, his training is in the classics, so
Yeah.
if you wanted to get in an argument about Latin phraseology, I probably would defer to his judgment.
Yeah.
But when it comes to climate scientists, you'd want to ask climate scientists who are actively publishing papers now.
So the this particular petition, which was organized by the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine, if I'm correct. Now you've got one of your short URLs for that, haven't you? So I shall just read that out in my normal Monktonian manner. http://sks.to/OISM.
Yeah, we have a page that just goes into a lot more detail than what I just said over the whole OISM petition. So that's definitely worth reading just to get a bit more background on it.
And also now up on screen we've got a wee graph. Does that go with the petition?
No, this is this graph. Oh, actually, that we do discuss that graph on that page. And what this is a survey of scientists, a whole range of scientists, and it asks in the question, do you think humans are significantly changing climate or significantly causing global warming? I think was the question. And what was interesting about it was they gave the results for different levels of expertise on climate change. So starting with the general public, just over 50%, I think, said yes, we think humans are causing global warming. And then all scientists, the percentage was about 70%. But as you got more expertise in climate science, the percentage of scientists who said yes increased, to the point where when you got up to climate scientists who are actively publishing research now, or at the time of the survey, 97% of climate experts agreed that humans were significantly causing global warming.
Okay.
So, and then there was another study which was published just over the last year or so by William Anderegg, who took a completely different way of approaching it. What he did was look at all public declarations about climate change, and he basically came to exactly the same result, which was that all climate scientists who had signed a public declaration, 97% of them were convinced by the evidence that humans were causing climate change. And the other interesting thing that he got out of his result was, as well as working out the number of scientists or the percentage, he also looked at how many papers they'd each published as a way of measuring their expertise. And he found that the scientists who were convinced by the evidence had published at least twice as many as those who weren't convinced by the evidence.
And what about, you've been looking at also Naomi Oreskes, and she searched the Institute for Scientific Information database for papers matching climate change, and 928 papers, 0 papers disagreed with climate consensus.
Yeah, I mean, it's helpful to see how many climate scientists think that humans are causing global warming, but ultimately you have to back that up with research published in the peer-reviewed literature. And so Naomi Oreskes did a search for any papers about climate change just to see how many were skeptical over, I think the period was 1993 to 2003.
Yeah.
And she found 0 papers were skeptical about humans causing climate change, or 0 papers disagreed with the scientific consensus position.
And we're seeing an image there of Al Gore. Did he use that in his film?
Yeah, that was an Inconvenient Truth. So that really, I guess, raised the profile of Naomi Oreskes' research.
Yes, it's interesting. Naomi says, and you might recall from the interview that you arranged kindly for us, John, that the sort of skeptical kickback to that paper was so strong that it actually motivated her to go and do the digging that led to her book Merchants of Doubt. So it kind of badly misfired for the skeptics, I think.
Oh, she's been amazing, Naomi. Like, she's one of my personal heroes, because just the not only the work that she's done, but also just her just seeing her talking and her strength of personality is pretty impressive. So, and when you combine that survey, that science paper, and also her book Merchants of Doubt, she's just made a great contribution to the whole climate science body of knowledge.
Well, that's nice to know, isn't it, Gareth? John's got a hero.
Absolutely. Well, it's a very good one, I have to say.
And finally, another table we have here, 2 columns, fact, fraud. What's in either of those?
Well, I just wanted to, another, I guess, measure of the scientific consensus is all the different bodies or organizations that have endorsed the consensus that humans are causing climate change. And just about every academy of science in every country all over the world has already endorsed it. But there are a whole range of other scientific organizations. But I think it's worth pointing out that there are a few organizations that still think that climate change is all a big hoax, or it's not a problem. And so I brought up the list there. There's a few interesting organizations on there that are worth pointing out. So there's a few petroleum institutes. There's a petrochemical association.
Yes, and there's the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a Koch and Scaife-funded libertarian lobby group. So.
Yeah, so there's while there are a few organisations that do reject the consensus, generally it's quite telling what type of organisations they are, if they're involved in the petroleum industry or the mining industry or right-wing groups. So
but then you got in there the National Association of Home Builders. What beef do they have with climate change?
Well, who knows? Actually, I'm a bit surprised to see that the Corn Refiners Association thinks it's a fraud, because don't they benefit from all the ethanol that George Bush decided that corn should be used to make? Anyway, never mind. So there is yes, Rosebud Mining, I think, is great. That must be isn't it? Rosebud was at the end of that great film whose name escapes me. It was the dying words of the newspaper magnate. Famous film. Anyway, never mind. I'm sure somebody will stick a comment at the end of the show.
Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane.
You got
That's
it.
the one. Rosebud Mining. Citizen Kane Mining. Anyway, enough of that. John again has a whole page at Skeptical Science discussing this, and the URL is http://sks.to/consensus.
Yes, indeed. Now, and before we let you go, John, we thought we'd include you in another segment we're going to include in here today, feedback, just because we did get a fair bit over the past couple of shows, but there's one that we haven't had time to respond to at theclimateshow.com, but David Lewis, who I believe was associated with the Green Party in Canada anyway, he's written a couple of responses to our last episode with David Suzuki, but one where he talks about the cultural cognition of scientific consensus, which is a book that he's decided to start reading. But anyway, he said the reason I was interested enough in this study to have had it on my hand in the file of things to read soon was because the authors examined not only climate change but nuclear waste. And he notes that we left out nuclear waste in our discussion. I think perhaps with David Suzuki we didn't have a whole lot of time, but when we also talked about nuclear waste in the previous episode as well. But he says, as evidence that the relevant scientists believe nuclear waste can be disposed of safely, the authors of Cultural Cognition cite a National Research Council study done as far back as 1990 by the NRC Board of Radioactive Waste Management, rethinking high-level radioactive waste disposal, a position statement, etc., etc., etc. He said, for the evidence, the relevant scientists agree on the basics of climate science. They cite analysis of global change assessments, lessons learned by the Board of Atmospheric Science and Climate, a board which is chaired by Nobelist Sherwood Rowland, by the way. And he says, I've not seen that one before. It's a review of lessons learned during past climate assessments done with a view to assist scientists doing future ones to communicate better. But anyway, he goes on. But do you think he makes some reasonable points there, Gareth?
Yes, I do, actually. And it comes back to what Professor Bob Gifford was saying in that interview I taped with him at the Climate Futures Forum. The way that we perceive problems conditions the way that we act on them. And climate change is actually a really, really difficult problem to deal with because, we're kind of hardwired to deal with short-term problems, to kind of fight or flee when we encounter adversity. And so we have to learn ways as a society that enable us to respond to threats that are kind of decades ahead. And we haven't really worked it out. Our political system doesn't seem to do it.
Now, David goes on, he says, in the US, it is the accepted biblical truth that no way has been found to dispose of nuclear waste. What actually is the case is that no way has been proved to dispose of civilian nuclear waste. He says the military is quietly disposing of its waste at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which met all approval processes and was licensed. I did not know that.
Yeah, well, it had to go somewhere.
Yeah.
But the cultural cognition thing actually is very relevant to what John was saying about, for instance, the Oregon Institute of Science and Medicine thing, because the cultural cognition project suggests that people who are what you might loosely call Republican or right-wing leaning in America tend to disbelieve in climate change, and that's I'm sure if we were to look at the people who signed the OISM petition, we'd find that they were generally or considered themselves to be on the right of US politics. So we're getting to the point where, and this is why the comment about the National Academy looking at the ways that why the message wasn't being understood or taken on. You've got this whole nexus of how human psychology and political organizations gel when they're confronted with, what ought to be pretty clear information about facing a problem. The information doesn't change. The nature of the problem we're learning more about. How we deal with it gets caught up in this horrible morass of politics, psychology, ideology, and campaigning. Any
thoughts on that as well, John?
Yeah, as a climate communicator, I've been looking more and more into the whole human psychology side of it, and what I've realised is there's a reason why I got into physical science, and that's because social science is a lot messier and uglier than physical science. So, and I guess human psychology, what I like to say is it's not rocket science. It's a lot more complicated than that. And so what I found is that with climate denial, there's not one reason why people are skeptical about climate change. There's can be so many different contributing factors, and that can be the misinformation campaign, which is confusing people. There's the media, which provide this false balance where they equate deniers, or give them an equal voice with the consensus of scientists, and that 50% portrayal by the media leads to a roughly 50% position among the general public.
Yeah.
But then, even if you could solve all those issues, you've got the human psychology side of it, where I mean, it's just, there was a survey that came out just over the last few weeks where they found that people's views on climate change were affected by what the weather was like on the day that they filled out the survey.
Yeah.
If it was a hot day, they were more likely to be accepting of climate change, and if there was a cold day, they were more skeptical of global warming.
Yeah.
So, and then there's other elements where people have a worry quota. So they can only worry about a certain amount of things. So if you add climate change on top of that, they think, oh, too much to worry about, and that can lead to a denial instinct.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think cognitive science is a key element in communicating climate change and just coming up with solutions, because for politicians to act, they need people to they need the general public to force them to act, essentially. And if the people don't care, the politicians aren't going to care.
I just want to pick up from what John was saying for a minute there, and that is that if we look at the activities of the people who've been trying to delay action on climate change, you find that they've been using marketing techniques and advertising techniques, and they've been doing research, and they've been conducting the focus groups, and so their messaging of the issue has been very sophisticated and has worked with the grain of human psychology, and that's something that came out quite strongly from Professor Bob Gifford's talk at the Climate Change Futures Forum. The fact that the professional campaigners against action were using all of the kind of cognitive tools that they had available, and it's now kind of 15 to 20 years later, science is waking up and saying, oh, hang on a second, we've got a really big problem here, we need to be doing the same thing. In fact, the authors session I had with Fred Pearce and Eric Conway, the moderator Sean Plunkett, who's a New Zealand radio journalist, said, well, you know, why doesn't the IPCC go and hire Saatchis, you know, to get the message out?
Well, that's actually a valid point. In fact, when I was talking to Eric Conway, I brought up that point as well. That and it also that issue reared its head, I think, when Ken Ring was getting all this publicity here in New Zealand as well. Is that on the science side?
Don't mention the
ring.
I
know. But often there is scientists are great at communicating stuff within their own community, but when it comes to communicating stuff to the public, they're not always the best people to do it. They're not always the most charismatic characters to do it. I'm not saying that about all scientists, and we've had some great charismatic scientists on this show. But yeah, you're right. Why not? In the end, why not hire a PR firm to help out?
Yeah, the problem is that, I mean, who does the hiring? I mean, there are thousands of scientists and hundreds of organizations all around the world, all working on the issue. Who gets to call the shots? I mean, I do think, in fact, John, you might be able to make sure I'm on the right track here, but I do think that the IPCC are looking at hiring or creating a communications department for the fifth report. Can you recall that?
I haven't heard that, but I haven't really paid that much attention to where the fifth assessment is going at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's been mooted, and I think it would be an extremely good idea. But the problem is that the inaction campaign has been fairly tightly focused and put together by a relatively small number of people, whereas trying to get the world's climate scientists to agree on things is a bit like herding cats. Trying to get them to all say the same thing at the same time would be even worse.
That's been my experience too in working with academics. Like if there's any evidence of a conspiracy among scientists, I haven't seen any evidence, because whenever I try to get things going, it does seem to be like herding cats. But I mean that with the greatest of respect as well.
I'm just wondering, is there a tinfoil hat there I can see? No. Anyway, John, look, thank you very much for that. A very interesting discussion. Just to say to viewers and listeners, if you would like John to deal with any specific subject, let us know in the comments, either at Hot Topic or at The Climate Show or at Skeptical Science, and we'll take that on board and we'll set John off on that particular topic. Otherwise, John, I think we'll just carry on working our way down the list, yeah?
Yeah, we're about nearly halfway through the top 10 list, so we'll keep moving down.
Cool, thanks.
Excellent.
Cheers, John.
Okay, see you guys.
See ya.
Thanks, John. Cheers.
And of course, also, if you've got any feedback for the show as well, don't forget you can reply either at hot-topic.co.nz on the actual posting for that show, or over at theclimateshow.com, or on facebook.com/theclimateshow, and even crank up a conversation on Twitter as well, twitter.com/theclimateshow. All right, and we're on the home stretch for the show. Before we go, though, we do want to talk about solutions. Solutions to this.
We do.
Yes, we do. This great climate change problem. And it's a special batteries edition this time around, Gary.
Yes, absolutely. Like the Energizer Bunny, we need batteries. The batteries are really, really important for a number of applications. One in the big picture, one of the things that we need to be able to do with renewable energy is store it. So, the wind doesn't always blow when we need electricity. So, to get the maximum out of the use of wind farms, it would be good if there were effective large-scale ways to store electrical energy. And there is a considerable amount of work being done on that. Then you've got, if we move towards electric vehicles, then the battery technology that will enable us to transition off liquid fuels is really, really important. And one of the big kind of limiting things with the performance of electric vehicles has been to do with the amount of power that you can store. So with the cost of the battery, the amount of power you can store, which determines the range of the vehicle, those things are beginning to come together in a way that allows electric vehicles to be competitive, probably still a bit expensive, but competitive. So there were just a couple of things that I wanted to talk about quickly. One was a story from Technology Review, which is a magazine published by MIT, and they had a story at the beginning of this week about batteries that recharge in seconds.
Tell me that I'll be able to recharge this in seconds, because that would be handy. I'm holding my phone up, by the way.
Precisely, and that the technology that they're discussing is likely to be seen first in small lithium-ion batteries. And what the scientists at the University of Illinois have been able to do is they have come up with basically a cathode, which is one of the active parts of a battery, made out of a nano foam. So slurry of polymer spheres, and then those things assemble themselves into a foam. And because it's got a large amount of surface area, it can take a lot of charge on very, very quickly. And they reckon that a lithium-ion battery using this nano-structured metal foam as a cathode could be 90% charged in 2 minutes. So it could lead to laptops that charge in a few minutes, or cell phones like your Android that will charge in 30 seconds.
Because in that case, then it wouldn't matter so much about the capacity, because that's the problem with a lot of these phones and laptops, is that the charge doesn't last long. But if you could charge it in seconds, that wouldn't matter so much.
Yes, absolutely. You could probably get away with a smaller battery, a lighter battery, if you knew that at the point where you were running into trouble, you only had to pull in somewhere and top up, as it were. The other when you talk about large capacity batteries, though, if you're going to charge them quickly, you actually do need to have a lot of current. So it's not necessary. You may not be able to fast charge your car from the wiring of your house. You might need special and expensive wiring. So it might be that you could get the fast charge, but you have to go to a special charging station to do it.
But from what I understand, though, with small devices and where it's going with consumer devices, is that you'll be charging them also wirelessly as well.
Yep, there's certainly work being done on that, inductive charging, wireless charging. But basically, this isn't in production yet. This is lab work that's being done. And they've got really impressive performance, which, if it can be scaled up economically, will really have quite a dramatic impact on the way that certainly small batteries are used, and in the longer run, on the sorts of batteries that we find in electric vehicles. The next thing I wanted to talk about is that the batteries that we have in our phones and laptops and so on, and in an increasing number of cars, are lithium ion. So basically, they're lithium with a chemicals around it that they can hold a lot of energy. Okay, their energy density is quite high, which is why we use them in things that need energy in a small space, like mobile phones or laptops. But it's nowhere. The amount of energy in a typical lithium battery is nowhere near as much as in an equivalent volume of liquid fuel.
Right.
So, I mean, you probably know, Glenn, that there have been attempts to create little fuel cells that will run inside phones, so that you just top them up with kind of lighter fluid, and then just because you can make very small. You can get away with very small batteries if you can have high energy density. So what this team, it's an article from a team in I think it's Denmark, either Denmark or Sweden. They're talking about fuel cells. Sorry, not fuel cells. The batteries that are lithium air batteries. So those, they have calculated, can have energy densities that are comparable to petrol and diesel. So if the other factor is that electrical motors are much more efficient than internal combustion engines. So only around about 30% of the energy in petrol actually gets transmitted to the wheels of the car. So if you take that into account and take a very dense lithium air battery, energy dense lithium air battery, you could end up with smaller batteries that would give you the kinds of range that you get from petrol driven or diesel driven vehicles.
Yeah.
And it actually makes it at least potentially possible to run really heavy vehicles like trucks with batteries based on this technology. Now, again, this is very early days. Lithium air batteries can be made to work in small applications, but they're working on commercializing it, whether it's a kind of 1 year, 2 year, 10 year, 20-year project. This particular academic team are working hard at it, and they think it's got real potential for the future. So I think that's really exciting.
Did you know this article on eScience News that we're looking at? It was saying that the electric car was introduced by Edison as early as 1900.
Yes, absolutely. And there was a time around about the 1890s, early 1900s, when it wasn't clear whether the electric car or the petrol car would succeed. In the end, the internal combustion engine won because oil was being discovered at a rapid rate. It was cheap. And it was easy to use, whereas batteries were heavy and expensive and used the only batteries they had were lead acid batteries, which are very heavy. So the petrol won out. Now, whether you talk about peak oil or you talk about climate change, we're now at a position where we have to be smart about the batteries and win out over petrol. And lithium air seems to offer us the sort of chance to do that.
Well, that ends the solution section for the show, and therefore the show itself will probably run far too long again, Gareth, but there's always so much to talk about, and I guess it's because we do it every 2 weeks that we bank up so much. So
yeah, absolutely. But then you're putting 3 professional talkers with guests into a sort of internet studio that's scattered around the world, and we end up talking. Well, what a surprise.
Yeah. And none of the constraints that I have on my radio show, which says, you got to play a song, you got to play an ad up next, and the internet allows you to be free.
Well, actually, this is as being something of a music geek, only probably dad rock type music geek. I've often sort of wondered to myself, what sort of playlist could you have for climate songs?
Traditionally,
so
has it only ever been that REM song? What do they call it? It's The End of the World as We Know It. That's the one that they always pull out for the news items.
Yeah, but you could have Stormy Weather, that old standard. That's a fantastic one, because we're going to see more storms in the future.
Yeah.
Perhaps our listeners and viewers might want to let us know about their choices of climate-related songs.
I'm thinking smoke on the water, fire in the sky.
Very good. Now I know why you're a radio presenter and not a rock star, Glenn.
Exactly. Terrible. Don't ever get me to sing. Why do I do it to myself all the time?
Dear.
Anyway, that is the end of another show, Gareth.
Absolutely. So we'll have a brief lie down now, and I'll try and fix my blog, and we'll be back in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'm going to take some time off in that intervening time, and we'll organise another guest before the next show as well. And keep those suggestions. We have got those suggestions banked up, but keep them rolling through in the comments at hot-topic.co.nz or up at theclimateshow.com, on facebook.com/theclimateshow and twitter.com/The Climate Show as well. Subscribe to the show on iTunes, the audio feed there. There's also the audio download and the show notes. Of course, there is the show notes as well. So if you are listening to the audio, never fear that you're missing out on everything, because you can always go to the post and take a look at the links there as well. And of course, the YouTube video as well, which is well worth checking out. Yeah, well, have a good 2 weeks, Gareth, and hope everything technically goes right.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have a good break, mate, and we'll speak soon.
All right, see ya.
Cheers.
What good is a drop in the ocean?